The hospital smelled faintly of disinfectant, which wasn't unusual. But there was something else. Something sweet, like flowers that had been left out too long, their freshness fading into something a little off. It wasn't strong enough to be alarming, just a little odd. As I walked down the hall, the click of my shoes echoed a bit more than it should have on the sterile linoleum floor. You'd think that a place like this would be quieter, more settled. But something about the way the air felt made me pause. The hospital was busy, but it wasn't chaotic. People walked with purpose, their faces a mixture of seriousness and routine. It felt like I'd stepped into a place that had its own rhythm, a rhythm I didn't yet understand. There was a nurse at the front desk who didn't quite meet my eyes. She was flipping through papers, humming under her breath, but her fingers didn't seem to match the speed of her eyes. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was something in the way she moved that didn't feel normal, like she was out of sync with everything around her. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease. The air was cool but not cold, and it smelled like fresh hospital sheets and a hint of something floral. I looked around, trying to find my bearings. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, the hum filling the space like it was trying to hide something. The sharp scent of disinfectant lingered in my nostrils, but there was also something else, a layer beneath it I couldn't quite place. I was here for my first day as a new nurse. They'd told me this place was highly reputable, that it had a certain standard when it came to care. The words had been reassuring, but the closer I got to the ward, the less I felt that reassurance. A colleague, someone I had met briefly during the orientation, had shown me around earlier. Her name was Karen, and she was the first person I'd really talked to since I arrived. She had that way of speaking that made everything seem normal, like she'd done this job for years without ever getting tired of it. But as we walked down the halls, she kept glancing over her shoulder, as if she expected someone, or something, to follow her. It wasn't just Karen, though. I noticed other little things, too. The nurse at the front desk again, still humming, her eyes darting to the door as if she expected someone to walk in at any moment. Then there was the sound coming from the far end of the corridor. It wasn't loud, just a soft, rhythmic thumping. I thought it might be a cart or a door, maybe a machine running, but there was something unsettling about the way it repeated, almost like it was following me. At the end of the hall, just past the emergency wing, I noticed a door slightly ajar. Most of the doors were locked or at least fully shut, but this one was open just enough to let a sliver of light spill out onto the floor, creating a sharp contrast against the otherwise dim hallway. I didn't want to look too closely, but the longer I stood there, the more I felt drawn to it. I forced myself to walk on. Maybe it was nothing, I thought. Maybe it was just my imagination, trying to make sense of the unfamiliar. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The hospital had all the marks of an ordinary, busy place, but there was something in the air, a subtle hint of something that didn't fit. As I walked past that open door, I couldn't help but wonder, what was really going on behind those walls? As I walked through the ward, Karen, the nurse I had met earlier, handed me a list of the hospital's rules. She wasn't in a hurry, which was a bit odd for a place like this, where everything seemed to happen so fast. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were serious, like she was passing on something important. "Here," she said, pushing the paper into my hands. "Make sure to read through this. These are our procedures. Some of them might seem a bit strict, but they're important. Trust me. Always check the ICU monitors before your rounds." The first rule made sense on paper. ICU monitors should be checked to make sure everything was working fine. But Karen's tone made it sound like this wasn't just a suggestion. It was the rule. The one rule you couldn't forget. Keep all patient files locked away after 11 p.m. A simple enough rule, But as I glanced over it, I couldn't help but wonder why the time mattered so much. After all, how could patient files be so sensitive? We were all in the hospital together, weren't we? No personal phones allowed in the ICU. Again, this seemed reasonable. The last thing you wanted was distractions in such a critical area. But when I looked at Karen, her eyes narrowed as she mentioned it, like the rule wasn't just about keeping phones away. It was about something bigger. You must sign out for every break, no matter how short. This one was new to me. It was a minor rule, but the way Karen explained it, so matter-of-factly, made me wonder why it was so strict. It's just how things are here, she had said. No exceptions. Do not leave the ward after 9 p.m. without permission. I found myself pausing at this one. It felt almost excessive, like something out of an old military-style institution. What could be so dangerous about stepping out of the ward after hours? As Karen explained the rules, I couldn't help but feel like I was missing something. It all sounded reasonable at first, logical even. But something about the way she said it, the way she handed over the list like it was a sacred document, made me feel uneasy. It wasn't just the rules themselves. It was the way they were presented. There was no room for flexibility, no understanding. The implication was clear. This wasn't just protocol. This was the law. I remember thinking to myself, it felt overkill, but everyone seemed to act like these weren't just rules. They were commandments. Later, as I went about my rounds, I couldn't stop thinking about the list. It was like the rules had taken on a life of their own. Everywhere I went, people followed them with an eerie level of seriousness. Nurses, doctors, even janitors all moved with the same robotic precision, checking monitors, signing out for breaks, locking up files, and making sure that nobody stepped foot out of the ward after 9 p.m. There was one moment in particular when I passed a nurse in the hallway. She had a clipboard tucked under her arm, and I heard her mutter the word "sign out" under her breath as she walked past the break room. It was like a mantra, like if she didn't say it out loud, she might forget to follow through. I couldn't help but feel like I was in the middle of some strange routine, one that didn't have any room for error. Even the way people moved, their expressions, their pace, felt scripted, as if the very air in the building was filled with these invisible rules, guiding us all whether we realized it or not. At one point, I found myself standing by the ICU monitors. I wasn't supposed to be there. My rounds were in a different part of the hospital, but for some reason I couldn't resist. The hum of the machines filled the air, a steady sound that almost felt comforting. But then I noticed something strange. One of the monitors was flickering just slightly, as if it was on the edge of malfunctioning. I glanced around. No one seemed to notice. Everyone was too busy following the rules. They were walking past the ICU, paying no attention to the monitor. But I couldn't help it. I felt the need to check. It didn't feel like a choice. It felt like I was required to check, like some unseen force was pushing me to do so. I turned back to the hallway, my mind racing. Was I being paranoid? Was this really as serious as it seemed? Or was I just getting caught up in the weight of all these rules? As the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the rules themselves. It was the way everyone seemed to act as though they couldn't even question them. No one asked why. No one seemed to feel uneasy. The rules were just there, and everyone followed them without question, without hesitation. But I started to wonder if anyone ever stopped to think about why things were done this way. Maybe I was overthinking it, but I couldn't help but wonder, what happens if you don't follow these rules? It happened while I was finishing up my rounds. The ICU door that had been firmly locked earlier in the day was now standing wide open. No one was around. I knew I had checked it before. I could swear I had. There was no way I had missed it. The feeling that settled in my chest was more than confusion. It was a sick, uneasy twist, like I had just discovered something I wasn't meant to. I stepped closer to the door, peering inside. The room was dark, just the soft hum of the machines and the faint rustling of paper. The smell of antiseptic mixed with something metallic, a smell I couldn't place. It made the hairs on my arms stand up. I hesitated, wondering if I should go in, but the feeling of being watched stopped me. I turned quickly, but there was no one behind me, just the quiet of the hallway. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, though. Why was the door open when it had been locked? I scanned the area, and the only thing that stood out was the faint, flickering light overhead. It wasn't much, just a slight stutter in the brightness, but it added to the growing sense that the hospital was off somehow. I looked around again. No one seemed to notice anything unusual. I quickly moved on, but the image of the door stayed in my mind, like an itch I couldn't scratch. Later that afternoon, as I was checking the patient roster, something strange appeared. One of the names on the list caught my eye. A patient, a man, listed under room 312. But when I glanced over to the bed in room 312, there was no patient there. The bed was empty, made neatly tucked in, as if no one had ever been in it. I double-checked the roster, looking for any error, but the name was still there. I asked a nearby nurse, just casually, "Hey, who's in room 312 today?" The nurse didn't even glance at the room. "Nobody," she said, looking at me like I was crazy. "It's been empty for a while." "Why?" I didn't have an answer. I just felt that strange, sinking feeling again. The feeling kept creeping in. Small things. A flickering light in the hallway, just like before. But this time it didn't stop. Kept flashing every few seconds, like some malfunctioning bulb, but somehow it was more unsettling. I couldn't focus. I kept glancing around, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The whole hospital felt off. As I walked to the nurse's station, I overheard a conversation between two doctors. One of them was talking about a patient in the ICU who had been stable, but something in their voice didn't sit right. It wasn't the usual medical professionalism. It was more of a nervous edge. But what struck me most was when I caught a glimpse of a name on the paperwork in front of one of the doctors. The same name from the roster. The patient from room 312. The one who didn't exist. The entire place was starting to feel wrong. The flickering lights, the strange sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. Low hums, distant footsteps when no one was around. Every time I rounded a corner, I felt like someone was just a few steps behind me, watching. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't enough to make me panic, but it was enough to make me feel constantly on edge. The air felt heavier in the hallways, thick with a stale, metallic scent that I couldn't shake. Every time I walked into a new room, the temperature felt just a little bit off. Too cold, too warm, too still. Even the soft murmur of voices from the other nurses and doctors seemed muffled, like the hospital was holding its breath. I kept telling myself it was just exhaustion. I had been awake for hours after all, and the place was so unfamiliar. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't stop the nagging feeling that something was wrong, something big. I tried to remind myself that these things could be explained away. The open door? Maybe someone had left it unlocked by mistake. The empty room? Could have been a mistake on the roster. And the name on the papers? Probably a mix-up or a clerical error. But deep down, I knew that something was off. These things didn't feel like mistakes. They felt deliberate, like someone or something was trying to show me something I wasn't supposed to see. I couldn't decide whether I was imagining things or if there really was something wrong with the hospital. Was I simply too tired, too overwhelmed by the long hours? Or was there something more sinister at play? The longer I worked here, the more questions I had. I was starting to feel like I was walking through a maze with no way out. Every answer only led to more questions, and the walls of the hospital, once so comforting and safe, now felt like they were closing in around me. The hospital had become more than just a place of work. It had turned into a maze, a place where the walls felt like they were closing in, and every hallway seemed to echo with the murmur of secrets just out of reach. Each day, the normal routines felt less comforting, and the very air seemed to thicken with something darker. I couldn't ignore it any longer. There was something deeply wrong about this place, about everything, and I felt trapped in a nightmare with no way out. It happened on one of those late shifts, when the hospital felt emptier than usual. The lights buzzed overhead, and the floors gleamed under the dull, artificial light, but the quiet was unsettling. I was walking down the corridor that led to the emergency room, my footsteps echoing off the walls. That's when I saw it. A figure, tall, looming in the shadows at the far end of the hall, standing motionless, barely visible in the dim light. It didn't move when I walked closer, didn't make a sound. It wasn't even breathing. "Hello!" I called out, my voice bouncing off the walls, the only sound in the silence. No response. I stepped closer, heart racing, my pulse pounding in my ears. The figure remained still, like a statue, yet I could feel its presence, like it was staring right at me. I tried again, my voice breaking slightly. "Are you okay?" Still nothing. I was close enough now to see the outline more clearly. A tall shape, dressed in dark scrubs, nothing too out of place, except for the way it stood, unnervingly still. No movement, no reaction. I reached out, my hand trembling, about to touch the figure's shoulder when it was gone, vanished. No footsteps, no rustling, nothing. I stood there, staring at the empty hallway, my breath caught in my throat. There was no way anyone could have just disappeared like that, right? I had to keep moving. It was like the place was playing tricks on me, like I was starting to lose my mind. I kept walking, trying to shake off the feeling of eyes on me. But deep down, I knew what I had seen, and I couldn't explain it. Minutes later, I reached the nurse's station. Everything was as usual. Busy, quiet murmurs, people moving in and out. But something was wrong with the monitors. The critical care unit's equipment, the life-saving machines, weren't responding. I quickly looked over at the console, but there was no response. No beep. The screens were blank. I was trained for situations like this, but I had never seen anything like this before. I double-checked everything, but nothing worked. It was like the whole system had just shut down. The monitor screens flickered and then went black, like the life of the hospital had just been sucked out in a single breath. The emergency backup systems should have kicked in by now, but there was nothing. I glanced around, but no one seemed to notice. It was like I was the only one in the room, and the silence felt suffocating. The thought of checking the backup generator crossed my mind, but I knew the procedures. If the system went offline, I should alert the head of the unit and follow protocol to restore the equipment. But my gut was telling me something else. Something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a technical failure. It was something far deeper, something I couldn't explain. The seconds stretched into minutes. The silence was oppressive, like the walls themselves were listening. My instincts screamed at me to act, but I was paralyzed. I had a choice to make. Stick to protocol, wait for the head technician to show up, wait for them to handle it, or trust my instincts and act on my own. The equipment was vital to patient care. If I didn't act quickly enough, lives could be at risk. But something in me hesitated. I couldn't explain why. It was like I could feel the weight of the decision press down on me, like it was more than just about the equipment failure. Suddenly, I heard it, a faint whisper. It was almost imperceptible, a rustling sound in the corner of the room, too quiet to be a person. My head snapped toward the sound. Nothing. The room was still. "Hello," I whispered into the void, half expecting a response, half afraid to hear one. I swallowed hard, my hand trembling on the control panel. The equipment was still down. The urgency was growing. I had to make a decision. I could call for help or try to fix it myself, but everything inside me told me to move fast. There was something about this situation that felt wrong, so wrong. I decided. The instincts that had been nagging at me all night led me to one conclusion. I couldn't wait. I had to fix this myself. I turned to the generator panel, my mind racing, not knowing exactly what I was doing, but somehow knowing I had to do it. There was a low hum as I reached for the switch. As soon as my fingers brushed the metal panel, I felt a jolt, a coldness that shot through me like a shock of electricity. My hands went numb for a second, and the room seemed to grow darker, the air heavier. The flickering lights above me started to flicker faster, like the building itself was trembling. Then it hit me, the noise. A low, vibrating hum, growing louder. It wasn't the machines. It wasn't the lights. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the hospital, somewhere just beyond my reach. I couldn't tell if it was a sound or a feeling, a vibration that crawled under my skin, making my heart race faster. I backed away from the panel, breathing heavily. My mind was clouded with panic and confusion. What was happening? What was that sound? In a panic, I turned to run, but then I froze. The figure I had seen earlier in the hallway. It was there, standing at the far end of the room, watching me, motionless. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was like I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by fear. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The figure took a slow step forward, its presence looming, cold, dark. I could feel its gaze, even though I couldn't see its face. The whole room felt like it was closing in on me. In that moment, I couldn't tell if this was real, if the figure was real, or if it was just my mind unraveling under the pressure. Was it psychological? Was the exhaustion finally taking its toll? Or was there something far worse at play here? Something supernatural, something that couldn't be explained away? The figure moved again, this time toward me. I was rooted in place, my breath shallow. What should I do? Should I follow protocol, run to the emergency exit, or stand my ground and face whatever this was? Every choice felt wrong. Every instinct told me to escape, yet my feet wouldn't move. The figure was closer now, so close that I could almost feel the cold of its presence. But just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the shadows. And then the lights went out. The hospital was quiet again, though not in the same way it had been before. It was a different kind of silence, one that felt heavy, oppressive, like the walls themselves were holding on to the echoes of what had happened. I was still there, standing in the same spot where the lights had gone out, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure had disappeared into the shadows, and the machines had suddenly roared back to life, their hum breaking the unbearable quiet. But the feeling didn't leave. It never really left. I managed to finish my shift, though I couldn't tell you how. The hours passed in a blur. People spoke to me, but their words felt distant, like muffled sounds behind thick glass. I went through the motions, mechanically doing what was expected of me, but my mind was still stuck in that moment. Those few seconds when the figure had been so close, when the air had felt like it was crushing me, when I was certain that something far beyond my understanding was happening. When the sun finally rose, the hospital seemed to transform. The hallways that had felt so sinister in the dark now looked ordinary, almost comforting. It was as if nothing had happened, like the night before had been a fever dream, but I knew it wasn't. I didn't tell anyone about what I had seen. Not Karen, not the other nurses, no one. What could I have said? That I had seen something or someone that shouldn't have been there? That the machines had failed for no reason? only to start working again as if nothing had happened? That I had felt a presence so overwhelming, so inexplicable, that it made me question everything I thought I knew about the world? They wouldn't have believed me, and honestly, I wasn't sure I believed myself. I kept replaying the events in my mind, searching for something, anything, that could explain it. A trick of the light, maybe? Stress from the long hours? Exhaustion playing games with my mind? But none of those explanations felt right. They didn't fit. The figure had been real. I had seen it, felt it. And that sound, the low hum that had crawled under my skin. There was no way I had imagined that. The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. Why was the patient roster wrong? Why had the equipment failed so suddenly? And why had it come back online without any intervention? Why did everyone else in the hospital seem so oblivious to what was happening? And most of all, what or who had I seen in the shadows? In the days that followed, I tried to move on. I told myself that whatever had happened, it was over. The machines were working, the patients were safe, and life at the hospital had returned to normal. But it didn't feel normal. Every time I walked past the ICU, I felt a chill run down my spine. Every flicker of the lights, every creak of the floor, every faint sound from down the hall made my chest tighten. I started to notice things I hadn't before, small, almost imperceptible things that seemed out of place. A door that was slightly ajar when it should have been closed. A shadow that moved just a little too quickly to be explained. The hospital wasn't just a building anymore. It was something else. Something alive, something watching. Even now, when I leave the hospital and step into the bright light of day, I can't shake the feeling that it hasn't let me go. The unease follows me home, creeping into the corners of my mind, making me question every sound, every shadow. There are nights when I wake up suddenly, my heart racing, convinced that I've heard that same low hum from the hospital. I check the doors, the windows, every corner of my apartment, but there's nothing there. Still, I can't go back to sleep. I've started leaving a light on in the hallway, just in case. I still work at the hospital. I don't know why. Maybe it's because I need answers. Or maybe it's because I'm afraid of what might happen if I leave. But every time I hear a faint knock at my door late at night, every time the lights flicker for just a second, every time I feel that cold air against my skin, I freeze, just in case. Because whatever it was that I saw that night, I don't think it's done with me yet. Subscribe for more horror stories every day.